It's Congressman Ed Markey, a Democrat, and former Navy SEAL Gabriel Gomez, a Republican, will debate in Boston. Live coverage at 7 Eastern on C-SPAN 3.
Well, the U.S. Senate will continue work today on the immigration bill. That measure would boost border security and workplace enforcement. It allows tens of thousands of new high and low-skilled workers into the country and creates a 13-year path to citizenship for the 11 million immigrants currently in the country illegally. Senators will today recess for their weekly party meetings from 12:30 to 2:15. At 3 Eastern, senators will vote on 4 amendments, and all will need 60 votes to pass. A number of other amendments have been proposed, and bill managers are negotiating over which amendments get a vote and when. And now to live coverage of the Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
Admiral Barry Black will lead the Senate in prayer. Chaplain.
Let us pray. Eternal Spirit, place your judgments in the earth so that the world's inhabitants will learn righteousness. Today, give our senators a strong and vivid sense that you are by their side. In their down-sitting and uprising, make them aware of your presence. By your grace, Lord, let no thoughts enter their hearts that might hinder communion with you, and let no word leave their lips that isn't meant for your ears. Surround them with the shield of your favor and give them mutual trust and loyalty for their relationships with one another. We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Following leader remarks, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for an hour. The Republicans will control the first half, majority the final half. Following that morning business, the Senate will resume consideration of the immigration bill. The Senate will recess from 12:30 until 2:15 today for our weekly caucus meetings. At 3 o'clock, there will be 4 roll call votes in relation to amendments to the immigration bill. And, Mr. President, I would simply add on that, I've had a number of calls already this morning saying you can't have the votes then. I've got this, we got meetings, and we're going to have the votes at 4 o'clock. This bill, we have to move forward on it. I was very happy we were able to get consent to have these 4 votes starting at 3 o'clock today. Mr. President, time is of the essence in this legislation. I've been patient, we've all been patient, waiting to see what amendments people want to offer. I want to make sure that on some of these major issues that people have had the time to work through them. We know that some of the issues are difficult. I appreciate I've been told that Senator Hoeven, Senator Corker are trying to work with the 8 bipartisan senators to come up with something that they feel is important for them to vote on. I have no problem with that. But I'm just telling everybody, as I have now for quite a long time, that we're going to either file cloture on this on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or Monday. We have to move forward with this legislation. So people, I urge people to work together to come up with whatever amendments you feel that are important. And of course, we're all looking at this major issue. I've talked to the Republicans, the Gang of 8, Democrats, the Gang of 8, and they're working on something dealing with border security. I have no, I'm not telling anyone what to do other than to do it as quickly as you can. time has come to make decisions on this important piece of legislation. We say we've been on it 2 weeks. We've really been on it longer than that, Mr. President. That first week of this break, there were meetings going on all over this Capitol on what we should do with immigration. So I would hope that people understand that this may not be one of our normal weekends where we shoot out of town to go back to wherever we come from. We've got to move forward on this legislation. Mr. President, I talked yesterday at some length on the budget. It's important. We're approaching 3 months where we have not been able to go to conference on this budget. And this is so extremely important. I spent yesterday morning at the NIH, Mr. President. I wasn't able to meet with all the heads of the institutes, but I met with 4 of them, plus Dr. Collins, who runs the NIH, National Institutes of Health. I'll have more to say about this later. But, Mr. President, South Africa, England, France, India, China's increasing their spending by almost 25% for programs just like we have at NIH. What are we doing at NIH? We're cutting spending. We have been they've been flat funded since about 2004. We gave, with the stimulus bill, which was now going on 5 years ago, we gave them a shot in the arm because of Senator Specter. But that money is long since gone. They are headed downhill, and they have been for several years now. These wonderful scientists we have there are leaving. One scientist at the University of Michigan, who, by the way, is best friends with my chief of staff, he's basically staying away from NIH because you can't have, and he's an expert, one of, if not the leading expert in the world on melanoma. And he's not making application for NIH grants anymore because you can't do scientific research when it's only available for a year or 2. So I hope that we can move forward on this budget conference and get something done on this to set the nation's financial problems in the right direction. We're not going to get anything done unless we're able to get something done on the budget. We can't do this. I'm proud of the budget that we passed. I think it's a very good budget. But I realize that if we go to conference, we may have to change some of the things we have in our budget. We're never going to get this done, Mr. President, unless we sit down and work this out as we have done for more than 2 centuries here in a conference between the House and the Senate. Finally, Mr. President, and I see on the floor my friend from Tennessee, senior senator from Tennessee, who has been longtime governor of the state. He has been Secretary of Education. We have an issue coming up soon. If we don't work something out here in this body before the end of this month, student loan rates will go up a lot. If we do nothing, they double from 3.4 to 6.8. If we do what the House wants to do, if we do what Senate Republicans want to do, this student loans will be used to reduce the debt. I don't think that's what we should be doing with students. Well, this isn't the time to debate this, but, Mr. President, everyone should be aware as we deal with immigration the next couple of weeks, we also have to keep this on a radar screen that we're going to have to do something about this. I have a number of meetings on this today, and I'm sure my Republican colleagues have meetings throughout the day, and we need to have as many as we can to work something out to get this done.
Mr. President, the Republican leader. Day after day, I've been coming to the floor to remind the majority leader of the commitments he made to the American people in 2011 and again just a few months ago, that he would not break the rules of the Senate in order to change the rules of the Senate, that he would preserve the rights of the minority in this body, that he would not try to remake the Senate in the image of the House, something that could change our democracy in a very, very fundamental way. And so the question remains, will he keep his word? Here's what he said on January the 27th, 2011. Quote, "I will oppose any effort in this Congress or the next, the one we're in now, to change the Senate's rules other than through the regular order, end quote. And here's what he said this year, after I asked him to confirm that the Senate would not consider any rules changes that did not go through the regular order process. Quote, "That is correct. Any other resolutions related to Senate procedure would be subject to a regular order process, including consideration by the Rules Committee." Now look, Mr. President, a senator's word, especially the word of the Majority Leader, is the currency of the realm here in this chamber. The currency of the realm here in this chamber. As the Majority Leader himself said, your word is your bond. If you tell a Republican senator or a Democratic senator you're going to do something, that's the way it is, end quote, said the Majority Leader. He is entirely correct. Senators keeping their word, well, that's just vital to a well-functioning Senate, but it's only part of the equation. We also need well-established rules that are clear, fair, and preserve the rights of all senators, including those in the minority, to represent the views of their states and of their constituents. That's the other reason why I've been pressing the Majority Leader on this issue. As a matter of principle, holding a senator to his or her word is important. But so is preserving a Senate that works the way it's supposed to. And we can't be assured of that until the Majority Leader affirmatively states that he will stay true to the commitments he has made. Now, I understand my friend the Majority Leader is under a lot of pressure. I've known him for a long time, and deep down I know he understands the far-reaching consequences of going nuclear. I think he actually realizes how terrible an idea that would be. Because once the Senate definitively breaks the rules to change the rules, the pressure to respond in kind will be irresistible to future majorities. The precedent will have been firmly and dramatically set. Some Washington Democrats say they just want to limit the rules change to nominations. Just want to make a little adjustment on nominations, which is why they've been hurtling the Senate toward a manufactured fight over a couple of the president's most controversial nominees. But Republicans have been treating the president's nominees more than fairly. At this point in President Bush's second term, he had a total of 10 judicial confirmations. And by the way, the Republicans were in the majority in the Senate. President Bush, at this point in his second term with a Republican majority in the Senate, had 10 judicial confirmations. So far in his second term, President Obama has had 26 judges confirmed. 26. 26 to 10. Apples to apples. This point in President Bush's term with a Republican Senate, this point in President Obama's term with a Democratic Senate. And I note that just yesterday the Senate approved 2 more judicial nominees. That leaves just five available to the full Senate to be confirmed. There are only 5 around here. Think about that. Of the 77 federal judicial vacancies, the President hasn't nominated anyone for most of them, and only 5 remain on the Senate's executive calendar. Moreover, only one of those nominees has been waiting more than a month to be considered. So it's hard to see this as anything other than a manufactured crisis. There's no factual basis for it. A manufactured crisis. So the question is, a crisis to what end? Where does this lead us? Well, one of the reasons the Majority Leader has refrained from changing the rules thus far is this. He fully understands that majorities are fleeting, but changes to the rules are not. And breaking the rules to change the rules would fundamentally change the Senate. Future majorities would be looking to this precedent. I don't know what the future holds, but 2 years from now I could be setting the agenda around here. And once deployed, the nuclear option may have fallout in future Congresses. actually forever altering the deliberative nature of the Senate, which has made it the institution where enduring compromises between the parties have been forged. So, Mr. President, it's time for sober consideration of the direction in which the Senate is being taken. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for 1 hour, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first half.
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, for the last few weeks I've been listening to the Republican leader ask the majority leader not to turn the United States Senate into a place where a majority of 51 can do anything it wants. I'm on the floor today to suggest 3 reasons why I believe the majority leader will not do that. Number 1, he said he wouldn't. He said he wouldn't. And senators keep their word. Number 2, in 2007, the majority leader said to do so would be the end of the Senate. There haven't been many majority leaders in the history of the Senate, and I know none of them want to have written on their tombstone, he presided over the end of the United States Senate. And third, the majority leader is an able and experienced legislator. And he knows that if Democrats find a way to use 51 votes to do anything they want to do, it won't be very long till Republicans find a way, if we're in the majority, to use 51 votes to do whatever we want to do. So let me take those 3 reasons one by one. First, the majority leader has given his word. The Republican leader mentioned that. At the beginning of the last 2 Congresses, at the request of the Republican leader, I worked with several Democrats and Republicans to change the rules of the Senate to make it work better, and we succeeded in that. We talked about it, negotiated, and we voted those changes through. We eliminated the secret hold. We abolished 169 Senate-confirmed positions. We expedited 273 more. We reduced the time to confirm district judges. We made it easier to go to conference, and in exchange for all that, the majority leader said he would not support changes in the rules in this 2-year session of Congress except through the regular order. He said, the minority leader and I have discussed this on numerous occasions. This is the Democratic leader. The proper way to change the Senate rules is through the procedures established in the rules, and I'll oppose any effort in Congress or the next to change the Senate rules other than through the regular order. I'd like to ask consent to include, following my remarks, the majority leader's comments.
Without objection.
Second, Mr. President, I was a new senator 10 years ago in 2003. I was absolutely infuriated by what the Democrats did in the first few months. It's the first time in history they used the filibuster to deny a president's judicial nominations for the circuit courts of appeal. It had never, ever been done before. So Republicans threatened the so-called nuclear option. We threatened that we would change the rules of the Senate so that we could work our will with 51 votes. Senator Reid said at the time that would be the end of the Senate, and he wrote that in his book called The Good Fight in 2007. It is the most eloquent statement that I have heard about why changing the rules of the Senate to give a majority the right to do anything it wants with 51 votes is a bad idea. I'd like to read just a few sentences from Senator Reid's book, The Good Fight, written in 2007. Senator Frist, he wrote, who was majority leader, had decided to pursue a rules change that would kill the filibuster for judicial nominations. Sounds familiar. And once you opened the Pandora's box, Senator Reid said, it was just a matter of time before a Senate leader who couldn't get his way on something moved to eliminate the filibuster for regular business as well. And that, simply put, would be the end of the United States Senate. Senator Reid continued, it's the genius of the founders that they conceived the Senate as a solution to the small state, big state problem. And central to that solution was the protection of the rights of the minority. A filibuster is the minority's way of not allowing the majority to shut off debate. And without robust debate, the Senate is crippled. Such a move would transform the body into an institution that looked like the House of Representatives, where everything passes with a simple majority. Senator Reid continues, and it would tamper dangerously with the Senate's advise and consent function as enshrined in the Constitution. If even the most controversial nominee could simply be rubber-stamped by a simple majority, advise and consent would be gutted. Trent Lott of Mississippi knew what he was talking about, Senator Reid said in 2007, when he coined a name for what they were doing, the nuclear weapon. Just one more paragraph. But that was their point. They knew if they trifled with the basic framework of the Senate like that, it would be nuclear. They knew that it would be a very radical thing to do. They knew it would shut the Senate down. And there will come a time when we will be gone. This is Senator Reid talking. There will come a time when we will all be gone, and the institutions that we now serve will be run by men and women not yet living. And those institutions will either function well because we've taken care of them, or they'll be in disarray and someone else's problem to solve. Well, because the Republicans couldn't get their way of nominating some radical judges confirmed to the federal bench, they were threatening to change the Senate so fundamentally that it would never be the same again. In a fit of partisan fury, they were trying to blow up the Senate. This is Senator Reid talking. Senate rules could only be changed by 2/3 vote of the Senate or 67 senators. The Republicans were going to do it illegally. With a simple majority of 51, Vice President Cheney was prepared to override the Senate parliamentarian. Future generations be damned. Those are the words of the distinguished senator from Nevada in 2007, eloquently explaining why this body is so different than the House of Representatives. And I would ask consent not only to include those remarks, but several more pages from Senator Reid's excellent 7th chapter entitled The Nuclear Option in his book from 2007.
Without objection.
And finally, and third, Mr. President, if the Democrats can turn the Senate into a place where a majority of 51 can do anything they want, soon a majority of 51 Republicans are going to figure out the same thing to do. And after 2014, some observers have said we might even be in the majority. Senator McConnell might be the Republican leader and the majority leader. Maybe we'll even have a Republican president. So preparing for that opportunity, I would like to suggest the 10 items, briefly, that I would like to see on an agenda if we Republicans are able to pass anything we want with 51 votes, as the majority leader has suggested. Number one, repeal Obamacare. Number two, S2, that would be the second bill. If I were the leader, I would put up Pell Grants for kids. You know, GI Bill for veterans, Pell Grants, they follow the students to the colleges of their choice, creating opportunity in the best colleges in the world. Why don't we do the same thing for students in kindergarten through the 12th grade? Take the $60 billion we spend, create a voucher for 25 million middle and low-income children. It would be $2,200 for each one of them, just the money we now spend. Let it follow them to any school they choose to attend, any accredited school, public or private. Number three on my list, complete Yucca Mountain. I've spoken often of the importance of nuclear energy to our country. It provides 20% of all our electricity, 60% of our clean electricity for those concerned about climate change and clean air. Since 2010, the majority leader has stalled the nuclear waste repository in Nevada. That jeopardizes our 100 reactors. That jeopardizes our source of 60% of our clean electricity. If we had 51 votes in the Senate, we could direct the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to issue a license. We could direct the Department of Energy to build Yucca Mountain, and we could fund the money to do it. Now, the junior senator from Nevada, who shares Senator Reid's opposition to that, said something about this recently. The day is going to come that either he's here or not, that's the majority leader, or the Republicans take control and it's a 50-vote threshold. These kinds of issues are the ones that concern me the most, said Senator Heller. When you're from a small state, you need as many arrows in your quiver as possible to fight back on some of these issues that you can be overtaken by. And frankly, the 60-vote threshold is what has protected and saved Nevada in the past. I'd ask consent to include Senator Heller's comments.
Without objection.
Mr. President, of all the Democrats who voted once upon a time for completing Yucca Mountain were to do so again, we could get a bipartisan majority of 51 votes today in the United States Senate to complete Yucca Mountain. So make no mistake, a vote to end the filibuster is a vote to complete Yucca Mountain. Now here's the rest of my list. I'll do it quickly, that I would suggest to the Republican leader, if he were majority leader, his priorities for Senate where we could pass anything we wanted with 51 votes. Make the Consumer Protection Bureau accountable to Congress. That'd be number 4. Number 5, drill in Anwar and build the Keystone Pipeline. Number 6, fix the debt. Really ought to be number 1, but Senator Corker and I have a $1 trillion reform of entitlement programs that would put us on the road toward fixing the debt. Number 7, right to work for every state. We'd reverse the presumption, create a presumption of freedom, giving workers in every state the right to work. States would have the right to opt out, to insist on forced unionism, just the reverse of what we have today. No EPA regulation of greenhouse gases. And finally, repeal Davis-Bacon, save taxpayers billions by ending the federal mandate on contractors. Now, Mr. President, the Republican leader and I have plenty of creative colleagues. They'll have their own top 10 lists. And when word gets around on our side of the aisle that the United States Senate will be like the House of Representatives and a train can run through it without anyone slowing it down, there'll be a lot of my colleagues with their own ideas about adding a lot of cars to that freight train. Mr. President, John Meacham's book about Thomas Jefferson is one I've been reading. He reports a conversation between John Adams and Jefferson in 1798. Adams said, "No republic could ever last which has not had a Senate strong enough to bear up against all the popular storms and passions. Trusting a popular assembly for the preservation of our liberties is implausible." Alexis de Tocqueville, traveling our country in the 1830s, saw only 2 great threats for our young democracy. One was Russia, one was the tyranny of the majority. And finally, as the Republican leaders so well stated, there's no excuse here for all this talk. The Democrats are manufacturing a crisis. To suggest the Republicans are holding things up unnecessarily is absolute nonsense. In fact, over the last 2 Congresses, we've made it easier for any president to have his or her nominations secured. The Washington Post on March 18, Congressional Research Service on March 23rd said that President Obama's nominations for cabinet are moving through the Senate at least as rapidly as his 2 predecessors. Since then, the Secretary of Energy has been confirmed 97-0. There may be another 3 up this week. And then, as the Republican leader said, look at the executive calendar. Only 3 district judges waiting. As for filibusters, according to the Senate historian, the number of Supreme Court justices who've been denied their seats by filibuster is 0. The only possible exception, Zabe Fortas and Lyndon Johnson engineered a 45-43 vote so he could hold his head up while he continued to serve on the court. The number of cabinet members who've been denied their seats by filibuster in the history of the Senate is 0. The number of district judges who've been denied their seats by filibuster in the history of the Senate is 0. This is according to the Senate historian and the Congressional Research Service. So what are they talking about? I know what they're talking about. They're talking about circuit judges. That's the only exception. And why is it an exception? It's because when I came to the Senate 10 years ago, the Democrats broke historical precedent and blocked 5 distinguished judges of President Bush by a filibuster. Republicans have returned the favor and blocked 2 of President Obama's by a filibuster, which should be a lesson for the future to those who want to change the rules. About half the Senate, Mr. President, is in its first term. They may not know about the majority leader's statements in 2007. They may not know about the history of the Senate. They may have heard all these conflicting facts and not having the right facts. What I've given you is what the Senate Historian and Congressional Research Service says is the facts. Of course there have been delays. My own nomination was delayed 87 days by a Democratic senator. I didn't try to change the rules of the Senate. President Reagan's nomination of Ed Meese was delayed a year by a Democratic Senate. And no one has ever disputed our right in the Senate, regardless of who was in charge, to use our constitutional duty of advise and consent to delay and examine, sometimes to cause nominations to be withdrawn, or even to defeat nominees by a majority vote. And yes, some sub-cabinet members have been denied their seats by a filibuster. The Democrats denied John Bolton his post on the United Nations. And Senator Warren Rudman told me the story of how the Democratic senator from New Hampshire blocked his nomination by a secret hold. Nobody knew what was happening. And I asked Senator Rudman what he did about it. He said, I ran against the so-and-so in the next election, and I beat him, and that's how Rudman got to the Senate. So in summary, Mr. President, the idea that we have a crisis of nominations is absolute, complete nonsense, totally unsupported by the facts. It should be embarrassing to my friends on the other side to even bring it up. They should be congratulating us for helping to make it easier for any president to move nominations through. And the advise and consent is a constitutional prerogative that both bodies have always defended. So there are three reasons why the majority leader will not turn the Senate into a place where a majority of 51 can do anything it wants, in my judgment. One, he said he wouldn't, and senators keep their word. Two, he said the nuclear option would be the end of the Senate, and no majority leader wants written on his tombstone, he presided over the end of the United States Senate. And three, if Democrats turn the Senate into a place when 51 senators can do anything they want, it won't be long before Republicans do the same. And to be very specific, if Senator Reid and Democrats vote to allow a majority to do anything they want in the United States Senate and set that precedent, voting to end the filibuster will be a vote to complete Yucca Mountain. So, Mr. President, I come today with respect to the Republican and the Democratic leader, and especially to this institution, to say let's end the threats, let's stop the nonsense, let's get back to work on immigration and the other important issues facing our country. I thank the President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
I ask consent that the senator from Tennessee and I be allowed to engage in a colloquy.
Without objection.
I want to congratulate my friend from Tennessee on a brilliant presentation about the history of the Senate and the current manufactured crisis that we face. And the only thing I would add, just by way of reiterating the point my friend has already made, you quoted Jefferson and Adams about the tyranny of the majority, or was that de Tocqueville? Washington, when presiding over the Constitutional Convention, was, according to legend, asked, what will the Senate be like? He said, well, it'll be like this saucer under the teacup, and the tea will slosh out of the cup down into the saucer and cool off. In other words, from the very beginning, it was anticipated by the wise men who wrote the Constitution that the Senate would be a place where things slowed down and were thought over. And that's been the tradition for a very long time throughout the history of our country. Until the First World War, it was not possible to stop a debate at all. Cloture was actually adopted by the Senate in the late teens of the previous century, and then lowered in the 70s to the current two-thirds. Looking at the history of our country, it's pretty clear to me the Senate has done exactly what Washington thought it would do. Slowed things down, moved them to the middle, and been a place where bipartisan compromise was by and large achieved, except in periods of time where either side had a very big majority, which of course our friends on the other side had in 2009 and 2010. The American people took a look at that decided to issue a national restraining order and restored the kind of Senate they were more comfortable with, that operates, to use a football analogy, sort of between the 40-yard lines, so to speak, between the two 45-yard lines. There's not a doubt in my mind that if the majority breaks the rules of the Senate to change the rules of the Senate with regard to nominations, the next majority will do it for everything. And the senator from Tennessee has pointed that out. I wouldn't be able to argue a year and a half from now, if I were the majority leader, to my colleagues that we shouldn't enact our legislative agenda with a simple 51 votes, having seen what the previous majority just did. I mean, there would be no rational basis for that. And so it's appropriate to talk about what our agenda would be. And I would be, of course, consulting with my colleagues on what our agenda would be, but I don't think there's any doubt that virtually every member of the Senate Republican Conference would think repealing Obamacare would be job one of a new Republican majority. And so I don't even have to guess what is likely to be the number one priority, repealing Obamacare. The senator from Tennessee mentioned drilling in ANWR. There's been a majority in the Senate for quite some time, both when the Democrats were in the majority and the Republicans were in the majority, to lift the ban against drilling in ANWR. I think that would certainly be on any top 10 list that I was able to put together as majority leader. Approving the Keystone Pipeline, we've gotten as many as 57 votes for that. We've gotten as many as 56 votes for ANWR. How about repealing the death tax? We've gotten as many as 57 votes back in 2006 to repeal the death tax entirely. There's a new bill being introduced just this afternoon by our colleague Senator Thune from South Dakota to get rid of the death tax altogether, to get rid of the dilemma every American faces that he has to visit the IRS and the undertaker on the same day, the government's final outrage. These are the kinds of priorities that our members feel strongly about. And I think I would be hard-pressed with a new majority, having just witnessed the way the Senate was changed with a simple majority by the current Democratic majority, to argue that we should restrain ourselves from taking full advantage of this new Senate. From the country's point of view, it's a huge step in the wrong direction. And I'm not advocating that, but I'd be hard-pressed to say to our members, precedent having been set, why should we confine it to nominations?
Mr. President, I agree with the Republican leader, and of course the distinguished majority leader agrees with you as well, because he said in his book in 2007, I read it, but I'll read it again, when talking about the Republican efforts several years ago. Republicans were so upset with actual obstructionism as opposed to made-up obstructionism, which is what we see here, but so upset that this is what Senator Reid said. If the majority leader pursues a rules change that would kill the filibuster for judicial nominations, and once you open that Pandora's box, it's just a matter of time before a Senate leader who couldn't get his way on something moved to eliminate the filibuster for regular business as well. And that, simply put, would be the end of the United States Senate. And what that means, it would be, the Senate would be like the House. A freight train could run through it. I mean, many senators have not visited the House Rules Committee. I have. It's an interesting place. The Republicans can run the House by a single vote, but if you go up to the Rules Committee, and I'm sure the distinguished Republican leader's been there, there are 9 chairs, 9 members. How many Democrats do you suppose have those chairs? 4. How many Republicans have those? No, I think it's more than that. It's 2 to 1 plus 1 is the majority in the House in the Rules Committee. But in the House of Representatives, whatever the majority wants to do, it can do. And so if we have a body with 51 votes to make all the decisions, and if I and others are deeply concerned about the nuclear waste sitting around at some of these 100 reactors, We've got several of us on both sides of the aisle who are working on legislation like that. And we want it put in a repository that legally, where it's supposed to be, we have 51 votes. If they all vote the way they voted before, to order the government to open Yucca Mountain and put the nuclear waste there. That's what you can do with 51 votes. So the way our government is designed, the House can order that, which they have, but the Senate hasn't, because the majority leader's been able to make this body stop and think about whether it wanted to do. I may not like that result, but I prefer that process for the good of the country, to give us time to work things out. And hasn't it always been, I would ask the Republican leader, hasn't it always been really the responsibility, maybe the chief responsibility of the Republican leader and the Democratic leader, to preserve this institution? Newer senators may not know as much about it, may not have as long a view, but over the time you've been here, hasn't that been, I would ask through the chair to the Republican leader, hasn't that been the responsibility of the leaders of the Senate?
I'd say to my friend from Tennessee, absolutely right. I mean, the one thing the two leaders have always agreed on is to protect the integrity of the institution. Yeah. And for those who may be observing this colloquy, they probably wonder why it's occurring. And I want to explain to our colleagues and to any others who may be watching why this colloquy is occurring. Senate Republicans are tired of the culture of intimidation. The culture of intimidation. Now, we've seen it over in the executive branch with the IRS, and we've seen it at HHS with regard to Obamacare. This feeling that if you're in the majority, if you're not in the majority, you need to sit down and shut up and get out of the way. And that mentality, that arrogance of power, has seeped into the Senate now. And the culture of intimidation is this: do what I want to do, when I want to do it, or I'll break the rules of the Senate. Change the rules of the Senate by breaking the rules of the Senate. In other words, it's the intimidation, the threat that's been hanging over the Senate as an institution for the last few months that needs to come to an end. And so I believe that is why the senator from Tennessee and myself would like the majority leader to answer the question, do you intend to keep your word? Senators shouldn't have to walk on eggshells around here, afraid to exercise the rights that they have under the rules of the Senate. And there's no question that all senators have a lot of power in this body. This body operates on unanimous consent. That means if any one of the 100 want to deny that, it makes it hard. But that's the way the Senate's been for a very long time. I want the culture of intimidation by the majority here in the Senate to come to an end. And the way it can end is for the majority leader to say, my word is good. And we quit having this culture of intimidation hanging over the Senate for the next year and a half.
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
I'd like to congratulate the Republican leader on his remarks, and it's important for those watching to know there are plenty of us here who know how the Senate's supposed to work, and we're doing that. You know, we passed a farm bill. We passed a water resources bill involving locks, dams, ports in this country. We did that the way the Senate's supposed to work. We worked across party lines. We got a consensus, got more than the majority, and did it. We have 8 senators who've come forward with an immigration bill. Tough issue, but we're working together to see if we can resolve that. I'm a part of a group of 6 or 7 senators who are trying to lower student loans for 100% of students, not just 40%. But we're not trying to ram it through with 51 votes. We're trying to get a consensus and then pass it, send it to the House, and hopefully they'll do it. When the great civil rights bills passed, they were a consensus, and the country accepted them because they were important pieces of legislation. When the Republican leader and I were young, and I was here, he was almost here, that we saw Senator Dirksen and President Johnson work together to get a supermajority to say to the country it's time to move ahead on civil rights. That's the way the Senate's supposed to work. And let's stop the threats, stop the intimidation, recognize the progress we've made, get back to work on immigration.
Mr. President, I just want to conclude by thanking the senator from Tennessee for a very, very impressive presentation and for his reminding us all of what makes the United States Senate great. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Minnesota.
are we in morning business?
We are.
Thank you. Mr. President, I rise today to talk about Medicare solvency. I know that to many people the words Medicare solvency, which is the ability of the Medicare program to meet its financial obligations, sound like an invitation to a nice nap. But you and I pay into Medicare every month, and we need to know that the benefits that we paid for will be there when we need them, and not just that. I need to know that Medicare will be around to cover my daughter and my new grandson when they become eligible for it. That's what Medicare solvency is about. A couple of weeks ago, we got some good news. According to the annual report released by the Medicare Board of Trustees, Medicare will stay solvent for 2 years longer than previously estimated. Now, there are a lot of things that are contributing to Medicare solvency, but one big thing is health reform. In fact, Medicare will be solvent for a total of 9 years longer than before we passed health reform. I'll say that again. The life of Medicare is 9 years longer today than it was before we passed health reform. As HHS Secretary Sebelius said, the Affordable Care Act has helped put Medicare on more stable ground without eliminating a single benefit. The point is that health reform is not just about making our health coverage more comprehensive. It's not just making sure that when we get sick, we can get the care that we need. It's also making Medicare more efficient. It's extending Medicare's life so that Medicare can keep supporting our parents and will be able to support our kids. How exactly has health reform helped extend Medicare's solvency? Well, to start with, it stopped Medicare from overpaying private insurers. Now, as you might know, seniors can choose to get their Medicare benefits directly from the Medicare program or to get them through a private insurance program that gets paid by Medicare, which is called Medicare Advantage. Before we passed health reform, we were overpaying these private insurers by about 14%. So we reduced what Medicare pays these private insurance companies. In fact, over the next 10 years, we are going to reduce these insurance payments by about 14%, which CBO scored in 2010 as saving Medicare $136 billion over 10 years. Now, I will note that we were told by some of our colleagues that if we did this, insurance companies were going to leave the market, that we weren't going to have Medicare Advantage anymore. Well, so far, enrollment in Medicare Advantage has gone up by 10%. And I'm glad about that, because Medicare Advantage serves an important purpose for millions of seniors across our country. We're also adjusting reimbursements to hospitals downward. Now, why and how does that work for hospitals? Well, when you insure 31 million people who previously didn't have insurance, hospitals are no longer on the line for uncompensated care when those 31 million people go into the emergency room. The hospitals aren't left holding the bag for all of those costs. And we didn't just extend the life of Medicare by 9 years. While we were at it, we expanded benefits for Medicare beneficiaries. Now, I go to a lot of senior centers and nursing homes in my home state of Minnesota. And I have to tell you that seniors are very happy about their new benefits. They're very happy about the new free preventive care that they get, the wellness checkups and the colonoscopies and the mammograms. They know and we know that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And you know what else we're doing with that money? We're closing the prescription drug donut hole, the gap in coverage under Medicare where seniors have to pay the full cost of their prescription drugs in that gap. I have to tell you, seniors are very happy about that. You see, for more than 1/3 of seniors, Social Security provides more than 90% of their income, and for 1/4 of elderly beneficiaries, Social Security is the sole source of their retirement income. So when Medicare stops covering the cost of their prescription drugs in the donut hole, that's serious. And sometimes these seniors have to decide between food and heat and medicine. Well, because we have been closing this donut hole, many don't have to make that impossible choice anymore. When I was running for the Senate back in 2008, a nurse in Cambridge, Minnesota, told me that when a senior would come into her hospital and be hospitalized, the senior would be treated by the doctors and nurses so that she would be well enough to leave the hospital. And when she left the hospital, they'd make sure that to give her the prescription that she needed. And after a few days, this nurse would call the pharmacy and ask, has Mrs. Johnson come in and filled those prescriptions? And the pharmacist would say, no, she hasn't. And why? Well, because she was in the donut hole. And guess what? In 10 days or in 2 weeks or whatever, Mrs. Johnson would end up back in the hospital because she couldn't afford her medicine. And these readmissions, they cost our health care system a lot of money. But now, because we're closing the donut hole as part of the health care law, these seniors are able to get their medicine. This is improving their health, and it's saving us money. So we've increased benefits and extended the life of Medicare. That was done as part of health care reform. Many of the provisions of the health care reform law will make our health care system more efficient and will lower costs in the long run. I want to touch briefly on one that I authored that's already keeping costs down for families in Minnesota and across our country. The provision of the health care reform law that I offered is based on a Minnesota law in a way. In 1993, Minnesota wrote a law that insurance companies had to report their medical loss ratio. Their medical loss ratio. And that's what this piece I wrote in is, not only do they have to, now what is the medical loss ratio? The medical loss ratio is the percentage of premiums that a health insurer receives that go to actual health care, not to administrative costs, not to marketing costs, not to profits, not to CEO salaries, but actual health care. So in Minnesota, starting in 1993, health insurers had to just submit to the Commissioner of Commerce, the Department of Commerce in Minnesota, their medical loss ratio. They had to compute it and submit it. Well, I took that and I made a little wrinkle to it. I wrote something called the 80-20 rule. And it says that insurance companies have to spend at least 80% of their premiums on actual health care for small group policies and individual policies, 85% for large group policies. And if they don't meet that, the health insurer has to rebate the difference. Well, thanks to this provision of the law, last year more than 12 million Americans benefited from $1.1 billion in rebates from insurers that did not meet the 80-20 rule, including 123,000 consumers in Minnesota. And a new report from the Kaiser Family Foundation estimates that premiums in the individual market would have been $1.9 billion higher last year if it weren't for the medical loss ratio rule, and that they would have been $856 million higher in 2011. That's more than $2.75 billion in savings over the last 2 years alone. And those savings are in addition to the rebates that consumers received. They're estimating insurers would have raised their rates that much more, $2.75 billion more, if they hadn't had to meet the 80-20 rule. That's another important way that the health reform law is keeping health care costs down. So my rule that I wrote has already saved Americans nearly $4 billion in health care costs. In fact, after going up at 3 times the rate of inflation, I would ask the presiding officer if I could have another minute.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Okay. Thank you. In fact, after going up at 3 times the rate of inflation for a decade, over each of the last 2 years, health care costs have gone up less than 4% for the first time in 50 years. That's according to data released by the Department of Health and Human Services. I'm not saying we're done, not by any stretch of the imagination. We have more work left to do. In fact, one big thing that we could do would be to allow Medicare to negotiate directly with pharmaceutical manufacturers on the price of their drugs. The VA does this, and they pay nearly 50% less for the top 10 drugs than Medicare does. I have a bill to allow Medicare to negotiate directly with the pharmaceutical manufacturers, and I hope to work with my colleagues to bring this proposal to the floor. At the end of the day, my job is about strengthening what works in our country and fixing what doesn't. Medicare works. It works for seniors across the nation. It works for grandparents from Pipestone to Grand Marais. And I hope to work with my colleagues to protect Medicare benefits for our parents and grandparents while strengthening the program for our children and grandchildren. I thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I have 8 unanimous consent requests from committees to meet during today's session of the Senate approved by the majority and minority leaders. I ask consent the request be agreed to and printed in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, when President Obama was first elected back in 2008, I can recall the transition period because his transition office was literally next door to my office in the Federal Building in Chicago. I can't think of a more exciting time. Here was my colleague in the United States Senate, had just been elected President of the United States. The whole world was beating a path to his door. Security was at the highest level, and I made a point of not interrupting him, which I would have done regularly when he was my Senate colleague, during this historic and important moment as he prepared to lead America with the blessing and the mandate of the American people. I didn't have a long list of requests. I did, but I didn't exercise it. I just spoke to him once or twice about a couple things that I thought might be helpful to the country and to him. And I recommended to him one person to appoint to his cabinet, one person. I urged him to appoint Ray LaHood as America's Secretary of Transportation. I was confident that Ray LaHood would serve America with the same integrity and energy that he had shown while serving as a member of Congress from our state of Illinois. As Secretary Ray LaHood prepares to leave this important cabinet post, I'm pleased but not a bit surprised to be able to say to the President, I was right. He was an excellent choice. In fact, one of the best ever when it came to the Department of Transportation. Make no mistake, Ray LaHood is a proud Republican. I remember meeting him first when he was a staffer for Bob Michel, who was the Republican leader in the U.S. House of Representatives. Ray was a behind-the-scenes worker for the Republican minority leader in the House, and I knew he was from Peoria, but little else about him. When Bob Michel announced his retirement, Ray LaHood said he was going to run for that position in Congress. What surprised me was that some of my closest Democratic friends in central Illinois said that they would financially support and do everything they could to elect Ray LaHood. And I thought, now this is really amazing. These partisan friends of mine think Ray LaHood, a Republican, is a good person for this job. And so I started paying closer attention to this new congressman. As it turned out, we became close friends. We worked together. We had adjoining congressional districts. Eventually, when I was elected to the Senate, we worked all through central Illinois on common projects, and I was happy to do it. Ray was not looking with a great appetite for publicity. He wanted to get the job done, and he didn't mind giving credit to Democrats or Republicans if we could achieve our goals, the local goals that we shared. Well, when he became Secretary of Transportation, I saw that same spirit of cooperation and bipartisanship. Anytime I spoke to President Obama or Vice President Biden about Ray LaHood, their Secretary of Transportation, they always said the same thing. He's the best, and we're sure glad he's part of our team. Well, the President couldn't find anyone better to carry out the transportation agenda for America in his first term. I believe history is going to record Ray LaHood as one of the very best in that position. He put millions of Americans back to work with the $48 billion in transportation funding that was part of President Obama's Recovery Act. He oversaw the creation of the nation's first high-speed rail program, a program that Illinois has participated in with great commitment and excitement. He also helped to create the Tiger program, a $2.7 billion investment in America's future that has built some of our nation's most significant transportation projects. And he helped save lives by focusing personally on our national aviation system. He also had another safety campaign. He conducted what he called, quote, a rampage, close quote, against distracted driving, people who were texting and talking while on the cell phone and trying to drive at the same time. He traveled more widely and more frequently than many professional pilots do. As a Washington Post reporter wrote a while back, there are just two kinds of states, states where Ray LaHood has been to spread his gospel of safety and to inspect transportation systems, and those states that he plans to visit soon. The people of Illinois are grateful to Ray LaHood, not only for his 4 historic years as Transportation Secretary, but also for his many decades of service as a staffer to Bob Michel and then as a member in his own right of our Illinois congressional delegation. Ray was born and raised in Peoria, Illinois. He stayed true to his Midwestern values throughout his career. He started his public service as a teacher in a classroom. He cut his political teeth working for another top Republican congressman, Tom Railsback. And as I mentioned, then he went on to work for Bob Michel. 1994, he was elected to Bob Michel's congressional seat in the 18th District. District stretches from Peoria south to the state capital in my hometown of Springfield. It has a history of some pretty outstanding congressmen in that district. I mentioned Bob Michel. I can include Everett McKinley Dirksen as well. And if you go far enough back in history, you'll find there was a young congressman with a part of that district by the name of Abraham Lincoln. Ray's a great student of history. He inspired a great effort to create the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, and I was honored to join him as a co-chair with Harold Holzer of New York. We observed President Lincoln's 200th birthday in 2009 with suitable recognition and celebration across America. Ray's work to help students everywhere learn a little bit more about President Lincoln and his role in America's history. Like his famous predecessors, Ray LaHood has raised the standard for civility and cooperation in Congress. In the darkest hours of the House of Representatives, when people are at one another's throats, it was Ray LaHood who reached across the aisle to a Democrat congressman and said, why don't we get together on a bipartisan basis with our families for a weekend? It seems so obvious and easy, nobody had ever thought about it before Ray. Back in Illinois, Ray used to convene bipartisan meetings with local officials, state representatives, and his dedication to the district and his service in the House earned him a reputation as one of the best. When President Obama nominated Ray for Transportation Secretary, all of us in Illinois knew the President had chosen the right person. Ray's legacy here in D.C. will be substantial, but it will be even greater back in Illinois. He has helped protect and build Illinois during his tenure at the Department of Transportation. It was such a treat to be able to call the U.S. Department of Transportation, speak to the Secretary of Transportation about an Illinois project, and have him know instantly what you were talking about. The O'Hare Modernization Program is a good example. There is hardly a more important economic engine in the northern part of our state than the O'Hare Airport. The modernization of O'Hare had reached a period of some difficulty and controversy. Ray LaHood stepped in, brought the parties together, and kept the nation's largest airport expansion back on track. Secretary LaHood, as I mentioned earlier, brought high-speed rail to Illinois. Last fall, we rode the first 110-mile-an-hour train between Chicago and St. Louis. He helped build a beautiful new terminal at the Peoria International Airport. Secretary LaHood's dedication to Illinois will be felt in every corner of Illinois for generations to come. People will be able to travel faster and more safely because of his work. He will bring new businesses to the state by those transportation investments, creating the jobs that we all want to see. Ray LaHood is a leader with integrity and character. He's also such a good friend. I'm going to miss him as my partner in government when he retires from the Secretary of Transportation. The Washington Post article that I mentioned earlier had a wonderful line. The reporter wrote, quote, "Perhaps the most telling tidbit in LaHood's life is that he's resided in Washington for 30 years without once getting a haircut here. A man truly lives where he gets his haircut, and for Ray LaHood, that's Peoria, Illinois." As Ray LaHood prepares to leave President Obama's cabinet and spend more time with his family, I wish the best to him. His wife, Kathy, who was often at his side, traveling back and forth between Illinois and Washington, will have more time with Ray and more time with their 4 children, Amy, Sarah, Sam, and State Senator Darren LaHood, and their wonderful families, too. I look forward to working with Secretary LaHood and his very able successor, former Charlotte, North Carolina Mayor Anthony Foxx, to maintain and improve America's transportation systems and networks, the backbone of America's economy. Mr. President, I ask that my